On April 29th, the studio behind GreedFall is reportedly expected to vanish. Not because players suddenly stopped caring. Not because one bad review killed it. Because it got trapped in a corporate insolvency chain that started months ago, spread through its parent company, then rolled downhill until Spiders ended up on the chopping block. Start with the parent company, because that is where the trail begins. On February 25th, Nacon announced that it had filed for insolvency and requested judicial reorganization proceedings because its available assets did not allow it to meet due liabilities. In plain English, the company said it could not pay what it owed when it was due. Nacon also tied that crisis to financial trouble at its majority shareholder, Big Ben Interactive, after part of a bond repayment was not made. So before anybody starts yelling about game quality, start here. The fire began upstairs. Then it spread. On March 23rd, Nacon said 4 subsidiaries had also filed for insolvency and requested judicial reorganization proceedings. Those were Spiders, Kiloton Cyanide, and Nacon Tech. That matters because it tells you this was no longer a neat little corporate problem sitting at holding company level. It had already moved into the studios. Once that happens, every team under that umbrella stops being judged mainly on what it could become and starts being judged on what can be sold, saved, or shut down. Now comes the report that pushed this into wider conversation. On April 28th, Push Square, citing French outlet Origami, reported that Spiders is expected to move into liquidation on April 29th. The same report says Nacon had tried to find a buyer for Spiders, failed, and would request liquidation as part of its restructuring. That last part is the key jump people need to understand. Insolvency is the point where the company admits it cannot meet its obligations and enters a court-managed rescue process. Liquidation is the part where the rescue has effectively failed for that entity. The studio stops existing as a normal ongoing business, and what remains gets treated like parts on a table. The reporting also includes one detail that cuts through all the corporate jargon. According to Push Square's summary of Origami's report, staff were reportedly being told to update their CVs and spend time on self-study instead of future production work. If that detail is accurate, then the internal message was not, hang on, the next project is coming. The message was, there may not be a next project. And once that becomes the internal mood, the public headline is usually just catching up. Now here is the obvious question. If the money trail is this clear, why does the internet instantly blame the games? That brings us to the jank argument. Spiders has always lived in that awkward two-a lane where people respect the ambition, complain about the rough edges, and argue endlessly about whether the studio is charmingly scrappy or just undercooked. GreedFall built a loyal audience. Steelrising did too, at least with a slice of players. Spiders was never a giant prestige machine, but it had identity. That used to count for more than it seems to now. Because in the two-a space, identity is often the thing that keeps you alive when you cannot compete with blockbuster scale. Then you get to GreedFall, the dying world, which should have been the next chapter, not the post-mortem. The details here matter. The game entered early access on September 24, 2024, and its Steam page lists a full release on March 10, 2026. Nacon's own release messaging pointed to the March console launch as well. So the strongest version of this story is not that players are stuck forever with an unfinished early access promise. The sharper point is that the game did make it to full release, and still does not appear to have landed as the kind of breakout success that could change the publisher's mood during a financial emergency. Public PC indicators reinforce that. Steam shows mixed user reviews. Steam B shows modest concurrency, not a breakout rush. In other words, they needed a miracle, and they got a shrug. That does not tell you the full console picture, and it does not prove commercial disaster all by itself. But it does tell you GreedFall, the dying world, was not obviously arriving as the event that saves a company already drowning in restructuring. There is also a labor history here that people should not erase just because the closure headline is louder. In August 2024, workers at Spiders published an open letter through the STJV describing instability, turnover, recruitment problems, low wages, lack of transparency, and management failures tied to expansion and multiple productions. Then in September, strike action followed. That means this studio was already publicly signaling internal strain long before the liquidation story entered the wider gaming news cycle. This was not a happy, healthy team suddenly zapped by bad luck. The pressure was visible. There is another missing piece that explains why a buyer search could fail even if the studio still had talent. People hear Spiders made GreedFall and assume buying Spiders means buying GreedFall. That is not how this appears to work. Nacon's own documents list GreedFall among brands in its portfolio, and earlier filings note that the GreedFall brand was folded into Nacon's game portfolio after agreements with Focus. That matters because it makes the studio less attractive as a rescue target. Buying the team is one thing. Buying the team without automatic control of the recognizable brand is a much tougher sell. And that is where the buyer question stops being trivia and becomes the center of the whole story. If Nacon had found a buyer, then maybe Spiders shrinks, maybe projects change, maybe jobs are lost, but the studio still has a path. A failed buyer search says the market looked at the team, the conditions, the ownership structure, the timing, and the risk, then decided it was not worth stepping in. That is brutal, but it is also one of the clearest facts in the whole breakdown. It also explains why losing Spiders matters beyond one studio payroll. Spiders occupied a lane that very few teams still occupy comfortably, single-player Western-style RPGs outside the truly massive budget tier. That is why the French BioWare label kept appearing around the studio, even if people used it a little too loosely. The point underneath the nickname is real. There are not many studios left trying to make this kind of game in this budget band. When one of them goes down, the market does not just lose a company. It loses one more builder in a category that was already thinning out. This is also why the wider pattern matters. We have already watched publisher groups under debt pressure or restructuring waves slash through mid-tier studios before. The names change, but the mechanism keeps looking familiar. Parent company distress hits first. Then the subsidiaries start filing. Then the buyer hunt starts. Then the market decides what is worth salvaging and what is not. Spiders is not some magical exception to the rule. It is another example of the middle of the game's business getting squeezed until identity, audience goodwill, and decent games stop being enough. So what do we actually know, without drifting into funeral poetry? We know Nacon filed for insolvency in February, because it said it could not meet due liabilities. We know it later said Spiders was one of 4 subsidiaries that also filed. We know Push Square, citing Origami, says Spiders is expected to be liquidated on April 29th, after a failed attempt to find a buyer. We know staff were reportedly being pointed towards CV updates and self-study rather than future project work. We know workers had already gone public in 2024 with complaints about instability, pay, management, and transparency. We know GreedFall, The Dying World is fully released, not still stuck in early access, and we know its public Steam signals look modest rather than game-changing. What we do not know matters too. We do not have a final court order in front of us here saying liquidation has already been granted. The reporting says it is expected. That is strong reporting, but it is still reporting, so the language needs to stay clean. Reportedly soon to close is accurate. Officially liquidated is a different sentence, and that sentence needs the final ruling behind it. That is the actual breakdown. Spiders did not simply disappear because people online decided its games were mid. It appears to be hitting the end of a longer chain reaction, labor strain, management complaints, publisher insolvency, subsidiary filings, weak breakout momentum, a failed buyer search, then reported liquidation. Another respected tour studio is getting fed into the financial shredder, yes. But the important part is that the shredder did not switch on yesterday. The gears were already moving. The final headline just made them impossible to ignore. 2 small editor notes would help this land on YouTube. Put a visible reported tag on screen whenever the video mentions the April 29th liquidation outcome, and use a simple flowchart when you explain Big Ben, Nacon, and the 4 subsidiaries. That visual structure matches the script's main strength. This is a chain reaction, not a mystery.